Okay, so my talk is going to be a little bit about what WYSIWYG editors used to be like, because since we're all working the front end, this is the tools that we mostly have had to deal with when we were starting off, correct? Yeah. So maybe just a little bit about myself now, because I've been using these tools since 1996. Yeah, that's how long I've been in there. And so a lot of these stuff that I'm going to show you now is stuff that I've actually worked with in the past. And but to be honest, I haven't used any WYSIWYG editors since the last 6 years, mainly because, like all of you, I like elegant code, right? And that's the big problem with WYSIWYG editors. So this is the very first one that we had. As a matter of fact, this is the very first HTML editor ever. This is what Tim Berners-Lee wrote back on his Next Step device. This is the original World Wide Web. I mean, it was not just the name of the web itself, but it was the name of the application with which you made pages. Because when this was made... A question? No. Okay. I'm just hearing things. No, okay, because the thing is that when this was made, this was basically just made for a bunch of scientists among themselves. They did not think that this would get as popular as it might be. So the idea was that, like Word or WordPerfect or any of the other text editing programs out there, you would just work on the text yourself, and you could just send it off to your friends, and they could link and then send it off to their friends. And since they were all scientists, they had usage of this thing called ARPANET for free, which became the internet. And that's basically how the internet was supposed to do. And as far as layout went, we're scientists, we don't need layout. But then one of the guys over in Chicago, in Champaign-Urbana, named Marc Andreessen, he came up with Mosaic. And the thing is, Mosaic didn't have an editor with it. It was like, we can now look at website pages, and you want to write HTML, you can use any text editor to write. That was his idea. And the thing is, now you could actually add images to web pages and do all sorts of neat things. But he didn't think about putting an editor in. He was more interested in the presentation. And this might not have been a big story if it wasn't for the fact that HTML is open, and the other two big things at the time, CompuServe and AOL, were pretty much closed. So if anybody wanted to make something, well, you went to the web. You used HTML, and you put up on an internet server. And thanks to Al Gore, who famously invented the internet, we can now have it instead of using AOL. Imagine if we had to do all this on AOL. But the big problem is now not everybody knows how to... Writing HTML by hand the very first time, even back when it was just HTML2 and HTML1, was something people had to remember, and closing tags and opening tags. So other companies came up with HTML editors, WYSIWYG editors. Some of the first ones were Claris Homepage. Claris was a company that used to be owned by Apple, until Apple said, no, we're just going to make everything ourselves. Another one that was around for a long time was called Hot Metal Pro. And after a while, Netscape came around with Netscape Composer as part of Netscape Communicator. Although that didn't really come out until 1996, 1997. But that was about the time when the internet was taking off anyway, so that's when we know about it. But once again, they weren't really that much faster than a text editor, and if you got into the knowing, okay, now I can do code, and you started working off with one of these editors, and then you'd flip back into looking at the code, you realize, where did all my code go that I wrote by hand? And that was the big problem that a lot of these editors had at the beginning, is that if you were they said, yeah, you can look at the code, but you can't, but we're going to keep doing things the way we think it ought to be done. And of course, some of the big players started to take note too. Adobe came out with a program they called Pagemill. And they sort of oriented that more to the people who already knew how to use Adobe PageMaker, Adobe Illustrator, that sort of thing. So it was very visual. It was very good for like making tables and things like that, but it was kind of clunky if you wanted to write longer web pages or use a website with more pages. And Microsoft, they weren't going to let anybody get out of their blick, so that's out of their field, so that's why they made Front Page with their little homepage wizard, which was okay. I mean, if you're a home user, back before there was Facebook and all that stuff, if you wanted to make your own homepage, you could do worse. But for us front-end developers, it didn't really get interesting with WYSIWYG developers until Go Live Cyber Studio came out. And it wasn't so much its WYSIWYG tools that it came out with, but it was one of the first editors that had little things like controlling if all your pages are actually linked or orphaned to each other. Because remember, a lot of the web pages back then were still static. And a lot of pages that we still make nowadays can sometimes we have to make sure we don't have any dark links or orphaned links. So this was actually a pretty interesting tool that you could actually see which files am I actually using, which files are actually being, which images are being used, because back then bandwidth was not about a dial-up speed. So images are still something that you have to watch out for. So this was something that was actually pretty good at cleaning things up, but it was only for the Mac. So a lot of people who wanted to do HTML couldn't use it. It was basically for professionals, because most of the times it was mostly ad agencies and professional groups that were doing web pages. And it got so popular that what happened was Adobe took notice and they bought them. And they said, to heck with Pagemill, we're just going to make Adobe go live from now on. And at the same time, another company, Macromedia, came out with Dreamweaver. You might hate Dreamweaver now, but back then it was actually a pretty good tool. It was one of the better ones that came out at the time. Version 1, again, was only for the Mac, but starting at version 2, they started writing it also for Windows 95. So it caught on pretty quickly compared to Adobe Go Live. And what a lot of developers liked was the fact that it actually, if you changed code in the code, it would actually respect it, respect the indentations and things like that, in comparison to other apps which would try to indent it the way it thought it should be indented and clean up your code for you, which Dreamweaver said, no, you did it, you know how you want to do it. We'll leave it like that. And that's what people liked about it. And it was smarter than that. I personally had one reason why I liked Dreamweaver, and that was because it was good when I went into the WYSIWYG at stripping out all the bullshit that Microsoft Word would pump into HTML. That was about the one thing that Dreamweaver did the best for me, but otherwise I still like to do my stuff with raw code. But look where we are now. I mean, WYSIWYG's no longer really all that important, is it? And there's basically one big reason for that, because we don't like to do every single change on a website, do we? Eventually, things like content management systems, shop systems, got cheaper to run. So not everybody had to be Amazon. Not everybody had to be a big news source which could pay for a Java server. You can now run PHP-based content management systems like WordPress for a big one, or Typo3 here in Europe for a while. And then came along Drupal and Drupal, because that meant we could set up a system. The guy in marketing or the guy over in the news department, he can do his press releases and set that stuff up, send that out, or you can manage your shop now, and you don't have to come running to the one guy every time that the CEO changes just to change the picture. So that's one of the reasons why this was no longer all that popular. I guess it's a short talk. We're talking about WYSIWYG editors. There's another reason why we no longer see that many, because now with the CRM, you can now do the WYSIWYG in there, because you got TinyMCE, CKEdit. They took off the F because they didn't like being called fuckEdit. UE Rich Text Editor was popular for a while, but that's now been discontinued. But it's now that people can do that on their own, and now that designers could actually set rules and say, no, you're not allowed to use font tags anymore. There was no real reason to use WYSIWYG editors. And some of our software we like Coda, PHP Storm, Eclipse, is stuff that we now use. And very few people that I know actually use Dreamweaver nowadays. So are they passé? I don't think they really are, because there are a couple of new players on the market. Come on. Okay, what's going on here? Oops. Okay, let's go. That's the slide I wanted to show, because now there are actually a couple of interesting WYSIWYG editors out there, not for us, but for the Photoshop designers out there who deliver their stuff to us. We can now tell them to use a couple of new tools like Macaw and Webflow. And what's good for us is that does a lot of the work in making the CSS and a lot of the work in making the designs proper. And it's also good for, a lot of them are now good for responsive design. They're actually pretty good at writing clean CSS3, so we don't have to correct a lot of stuff anymore. And that's basically a lot of what's now being done. WYSIWYG editors are not going to go away, because I don't think they should. People, we don't want to be the only ones who make websites. I think we should still want even our moms, our dads, our kids also to make websites. And I hope that we get more tools like this in the future as well for them. Now go make something. Thank you. Questions?
One of the technologies that changed a lot is Markdown.
Oh yes, Markdown from John Gruber. John Gruber there was originally written, John Gruber wrote a website called Daring Fireball, basically for Mac users. And when he was writing his page, he was tired of writing HTML all the time. And so he thought, wait a second, there are little things that we use as normal text conventions, like putting asterisks around things that we want bold, or using equal signs to say, okay, this is going to be my headline. So he wrote an app to transform this automatically into WordPress text, because he was one of the very first users of WordPress, and he called it Markdown. He doesn't really own it, but he does like people to respect that. He was the one who wrote it, so I think he still keeps the copyright. But Markdown is something that is very popular now for being able to write stuff, letting people write their stuff, and then we can put it online and transform it into HTML, only that we don't have to worry about people putting 5 bold tags within each other, which also sometimes that happens, that people make their own HTML. And a problem that WYSIWYG editors used to have. So yeah, Markdown is another thing that changed the way HTML is written, because now we write a lot of stuff now, and a lot of our body text in Markdown.
So I think that actually, I just came across something. I think that actually WYSIWYG editors are coming back in some way, and actually coming back big time. So if you think about websites like Jimdo, where you can register and set up the website from a template, and then you change stuff on the website, like in the browser, right? It's all web-based, and you change stuff on the website you want to make, like a WYSIWYG editor back in the day. So it's the exact same thing. And I just remember this because I set up a website like this for my mother-in-law. She knows nothing about HTML, nothing about websites at all, but she can go there, log in, and just change stuff, like change fonts and change,
that's another
change
thing.
templates. And I think I haven't exported in full, but I think it sort of respects your code. It at least has a section where you can modify the generated code. So that reminds me a lot of the...
Yeah, I think a lot of it also is that the fact that these are now websites that are doing this and not applications that you have to install on your computer. So it doesn't matter if you have Mac or Linux or Windows or whatever, it's the website itself can now control that. Like that, or Squarespace is another big controller of that. Anybody else have anything to add?
I played with Macaw like 2 times, trying to build something. It's not Dreamweaver by any means.
No, I don't think it even wants to be Dreamweaver.
No, I agree, because it wants to do like proper responsive web design. The thing is that like killed it for me, at least both times I tried. It's not a mobile first approach. It's just desktop first approach. So it feels like the media queries, it puts them before the big. It decides how it looks in the big ones first, and then you go smaller. Yeah. But for some cases, it is actually useful. Like we now, from one of our versions, we do work with like desktop first approach.
Yeah, I would have said instead of being desktop first, it's a graphic designer first approach. It's not so much interested in the code, but it's trying to make the graphic designer so he can take what he wants, do a lot of the work that we would have to do in trying to translate his thoughts, and then he can give us the click dummy or the mock-up that we can actually better put into real code and put into production, whether it's JHTML or PHP, or even if you're using Go or a different server. Yeah, so WYSIWYG's still good for small things. It's just that we're not used to doing big things. Okay.
I think these WYSIWYG editors might be cool for like a single page thing, so you want to generate a single page. So I was thinking, where would I use them? And And I was thinking in the lines of HTML newsletters, for example, that a lot of companies send. Do you know what editor do they use? Because I have no clue.
I do know that MailChimp has its own layout system that you can use, for example. And I think more of these newsletter systems are including their own design WYSIWYG tools inside the web page itself, which means you do not need an editor because the editor is then built into the page or built into the content management system. And so people really, when they're doing those sorts of web pages, they don't really use WYSIWYG editors that much to make them. They go straight into the application and build it there.